Poseidon slammed his trident down, and the seabed split like fragile glass. An entire civilization gasped as the waves rose to claim their souls. History calls it a myth, but the ancient stones remember the truth. Long before the first dusty stones of the pyramids were ever laid in Egypt, a golden empire stood at the very edge of the known world. It was a kingdom born of the salt and the stars, a maritime titan that commanded the great ocean stream and held. Yet, this pinnacle of human and divine achievement was not destined to fade through the slow, creeping rot of centuries. Instead, its end arrived with a terrifying rhythmic finality that's— imagine a sun rising over a metropolis of impossible marble, its circular harbors teeming with 1,200 ships, and then imagine that same sun set in a span of exactly 1 day and 1 night of misfortune. The greatest power the world had ever seen was erased from the maps and the memories of men. There was no warning, no mercy, and no slow decline. There was only the portentous roar of the earth turning against its arrogant children. The ground beneath the great concentric rings of the capital city began to heave like a wounded leviathan, toppling the massive palaces and throwing the glittering walls of orichalcum into the encroaching mud. The sky turned the color of bruised iron as the ocean, once the source of their infinite wealth, became their final, cold executioner. From the heights of the heavens, the decree had been spoken. Let the waters hide what the heart has corrupted, the earth shaker is said. As the clock of the cosmos struck the final 24th hour, the pillars of Heracles stood silent guard over a horizon that no longer held a shore. A haunting, silt-filled silence replaced the heartbeat of an— This is the account of the impossible empire. A civilization so grand that the gods themselves had to pull the ocean over it like a heavy shroud to keep the world safe from its pride. To understand the scale of what was lost, you must first see Atlantis as the sun once saw it, rising over the pillars of Heracles. It was a marvel of divine geometry, a city of concentric rings carved into the earth by the very hand of Poseidon himself. Imagine 3 circles of deep water and 2 of rich land, perfectly balanced, connected by bridges that seemed to float upon the azure sea and tunnels cut through the earth wide enough for the great triremes to pass through. At the very heart of this terrestrial crown sat the Acropolis, a citadel so magnificent it defied the mortal eye and challenged the heavens. Here, the walls did not merely stand, they glowed with an otherworldly fire. The Atlanteans mined a legendary substance known as orichalcum, a metal of shadow and flame that flashed with a reddish light unlike anything seen in the modern world. It was more precious than silver, second only to gold, and they used it to plate the exterior of their great towers until the entire city burned like a fallen star against the horizon. Inside the grand temple of Poseidon, the walls were a mosaic of this red metal and ivory, centered around an enormous golden statue of the sea god, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. "My sons," Poseidon had declared when he first partitioned the land and sea, "this island shall be the jewel of the depths, and your law shall be the law of the waves." King Atlas took those words to heart, ruling with a wisdom that matched his divine strength. The blood that flowed through the veins of the Atlantean nobility was not entirely of this earth, for this was a race born of a divine union. Atlas, the firstborn, became the first king, wearing a crown that commanded the respect of every nation from the setting sun to the distant shores of Libya and Asia Minor. Under the reign of Atlas and his 9 brothers, the empire grew into a titan of industry and art. Their central harbor was a forest of masts, 1,200 ships deep, where merchants from the furthest edges of the ocean stream came. 10,000 chariots stood ready in the royal stalls, their wheels and axle trees plated in that same shimmering orichalcum, representing a power that knew no rival on land or sea. It was a time of absolute abundance, where the earth yielded 2 harvests every year and the mountain forest. This was the Golden Age, a moment when the line between the divine and the mortal was as thin as a sea mist, and for 1,000 years it truly seemed the sun would never set on the empire of King Atlas. For generations, the blood of Poseidon ran thick, and they were a people who walked with a foot in two worlds, the mortal and the divine. In those early centuries, the spirit of the sea god governed their hearts, manifesting as a profound wisdom that prioritized virtue over gold and friendship over power. They looked upon their vast stores of orichalcum, that shimmering reddish metal that coated the very walls of their temples, not as a source of pride, but as a mere gift from the earth to be used for the glory of the gods. Their laws were etched into a pillar of orichalcum standing in the center of the island, a testament to the They understood that as long as the divine portion remained dominant within them, their empire would flourish. But even the strongest foundations can be eroded by the slow, rhythmic licking of the waves of hubris. As the centuries bled into millennia, the divine portion within them began to fade, diluted by the recurring mixture with the human temper. The divine nature that had once made them masters of themselves vanished, replaced by a hollow, grasping ambition. The Atlanteans, once content with the bounty of their concentric rings, began to look toward the horizon with narrowed eyes. The kings became obsessed with the outward show of wealth, adorning themselves in chidons of the finest dyed linens and heavy jewelry of gold, while their inner spirits withered like vines in a salt storm. They stopped seeking the counsel of the sea and began to demand the obedience of the world. "We are the sons of the ocean." One of the later kings was said to have declared to a gathering of his peers while standing atop the ivory inlaid throne, "And it is only right that the lesser nations of the earth pay tribute to our shadow." This was the turning point where the empire of light began to cast its first deep shadows of darkness across the known world. But the most what started as a whisper of vanity soon became a roar of imperial. Their fleet of 1,200 ships, once symbols of peaceful maritime commerce, were retrofitted as terrifying instruments of subjugation. Their bronze-clad prows, 10,000 chariots stood ready in the Great Plains, not for the protection of the innocent, but for the violent conquest of distant lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles. They pushed their boundaries into the regions of Libya and toward the gates of Asia Minor, enslaving those who could not match their naval might. The Royal Navy, once a marvel of engineering that brought the world's treasures to their central harbor, now returned only with the heavy spoils of war and the chains of the conquered. Inside the great temple of Poseidon, the air grew heavy with the suffocating scent of unearned pride. The 10 kings, once a harmonious brotherhood of justice, began to turn on one another, their hearts poisoned by the very orichalcum they once used to honor their father. They forgot that the great earth-shaker, Poseidon, was watching from the depths, and above him, Zeus, the king of gods, observed the moral bankrupting of a civilization he had once admired. The stage was set for a divine intervention that would prove just how fragile an empire of gold can be when it loses its soul. The sun rose on that final day, not as a herald of light, but as a grim witness to a tragedy that would echo through 10,000 years. It began with a low, visceral hum that vibrated through the soles of every citizen's feet, a sound like the grinding of the very bones of the world. The great concentric rings of Atlantis, those marvels of engineering and divine architecture, started to shudder under the weight of an invisible judgment. The first earthquake hit at midday, a portentous tremor that cracked the polished orichalcum walls of the royal palace as if they were fragile parchment. In the central harbor, the pride of the empire, a fleet of 1,200 mighty ships, tossed like discarded toys in a boiling cauldron. The sailors, men who had once scanned the horizon with the cold arrogance of conquerors, now clung to their rigging in desperation, watching in sheer terror as the sea they believed they had mastered began to reclaim its own. Zeus, observing from his celestial throne that the divine nectar in the Atlantean veins had been poisoned by human greed and imperialistic hubris, enacted his final decree. He did not need a legion of soldiers. He needed only the raw, primordial power of the foundations of the earth. By the time the moon climbed into a choked and soot-heavy night sky, the great floods arrived. These were not mere storm surges. They were towering walls of black salt water, ancient and relentless. The 10,000 chariots that once stood ready to crush the virtuous armies of ancient Athens were swept away in an instant, a slurry of mud and broken marble where golden axles snapped like dry twigs under the foot of a giant. The bridges that spanned the concentric rings collapsed into the deep tunnels, sealing the fate of the wealthy within their own gilded shrines. For 24 agonizing hours, the earth screamed and the sky wept, a twin assault of earthquake and inundation that as the following dawn broke over a hollow world. The Atlantic Ocean had returned to a smooth, indifferent sheet of gray. The mountains, the temples, and the shimmering red-gold gleam of Atlantis were gone. In exactly 1 day and 1 night, the labor of centuries was erased, leaving behind only a silt-choked sea and a warning that would murmur through the waves forever. The churning foam eventually settled into a thick, impenetrable layer of mud, a silent shroud that veiled the grave of Atlantis for nearly 9,000 years. The world moved on, but the story refused to sleep beneath the waves. It traveled as a whisper along the trade winds, eventually finding sanctuary in the ancient city of Say. There, in the sacred temple of Neith, Egyptian priests recorded the tragedy upon pillars that defied the erosion of time. It was the Athenian statesman Solon who, around the year 590 before the Common Era, sat before these keepers of memory. He listened as the high priest, perhaps the one later known as Sonchus of Sais, spoke of a history far older than his own people's records. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were but children in the eyes of time, unaware of the great cycles of destruction and the empire that had once challenged the pillars of the world. When this knowledge finally reached the hand of Plato 3 centuries later, it was transformed from a traveler's tale into a profound philosophical warning. Through his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, the philosopher immortalized the fall of the island kingdom to illustrate a terrifying truth: that even the most glittering civilization, blessed with divine lineage and mountains of ore, he left the story of Critias unfinished, ending mid-sentence as the gods gathered to cast their final judgment, as if the lesson itself were too heavy for any mortal pen to complete. In the centuries that followed, the legend ebbed and flowed through the human consciousness. It inspired the maps of explorers and the dreams of 19th century visionaries like Ignatius Donnelly, who sought a physical continent in the shifting sands of the Atlantic floor. Science has since mapped the obsidian depths and the tectonic plates, finding no sunken continent to match the island larger than Libya and Asia combined. Yet, the myth of Atlantis remains more durable than any stone monument. It lives in our collective memory as the ultimate tragedy of hubris, a reminder that when we trade our divine nature for the pursuit of shadow and gold, the earth itself may decide to reclaim the ground beneath our feet. The shadow of the triple rings of water still haunts the edge of our maps, reminding us that every empire is but one. The ancient stories still speak to us. Subscribe to hear more. Tell us in the comments.